June 4th, 1942. 10:26 a.m., 240 nautical miles northwest of Midway Atoll. Rear Admiral Taman Yamaguchi stood on the bridge of the carrier Hiryu, watching 3 American dive bombers emerge from scattered clouds at 14,000 feet. The attack seemed insignificant. Just 3 aircraft against the combined fleet's mightiest striking force. His staff officers barely glanced up from their plotting tables. Then, in the span of 5 minutes, Yamaguchi watched the impossible unfold. The dive bombers screamed down toward the carrier Kaga, visible 4 kilometers to port. Bombs struck with surgical precision. Massive explosions erupted as aviation fuel ignited. Within seconds, Kaga transformed from a functional warship into a floating inferno. Yamaguchi's gaze shifted to starboard, where Akagi, flagship of the mobile force, was also burning. Behind them, Soryu listed heavily, its flight deck shattered. 3 fleet carriers, the striking arm that had dominated the Pacific for 6 months, were dying simultaneously. Yamaguchi grabbed his signal officer's shoulder and spoke words that would haunt survivors. The Americans have executed perfect coordination. This was not luck. This was not chance. This was doctrine we dismissed as impossible. We have lost the war. 4 Japanese fleet carriers would sink that day, carrying with them 248 aircraft and 3,057 highly trained naval aviators and crew. The Imperial Japanese Navy had entered the battle as the most powerful carrier force ever assembled, commanded by admirals who had refined naval aviation doctrine to near perfection. They faced an American fleet they had been assured was inferior in training, equipment, and tactical sophistication. The mathematics of this miscalculation were being written not in the strategic assessments that had predicted easy victory, but in the smoking wreckage of Japan's carrier aviation elite sinking beneath Pacific waters. The statistics told a story of absolute catastrophe. In the span of 5 minutes between 10:22 and 10:27 a.m. on June 4, 1942, American dive bombers destroyed the offensive striking power that Japan had spent 2 decades building. Akagi, veteran of Pearl Harbor and flagship of the mobile force, burning uncontrollably with 267 dead. Kaga, the converted battleship that had pioneered Japanese carrier operations, torn apart by secondary explosions with 811 killed. Soryu, the fast carrier that had struck targets from Hawaii to the Indian Ocean, engulfed in flames with 701 dead. And later that evening, Hiryu, the 4th and final carrier, crippled by bombs and scuttled the next morning with 392 additional casualties. These were not simply ships lost. They were the irreplaceable core of Japanese naval aviation, 4 of the 6 carriers that had executed the Pearl Harbor attack, vessels that represented Japan's mastery of carrier warfare, crewed by elite pilots whose 3-year training programs produced aviators of unmatched skill. The Japanese had entered the Battle of Midway with absolute confidence in their tactical superiority. They deployed 200 ships, including 8 carriers, 11 battleships, and 22 cruisers. They possessed numerical superiority in pilots, in aircraft quality, in combat experience. Their admirals had refined carrier doctrine through systematic study since the 1920s, developing tactics for massed carrier strikes that could overwhelm any opposition. Their pilots underwent training regimens so rigorous that 60% of candidates washed out before qualifying for carrier operations. They had achieved unbroken victory for 6 months across the Pacific, from Pearl Harbor to the Indian Ocean to the Coral Sea. Every engagement had confirmed what Japanese naval leadership believed, that American carrier doctrine was fragmented and defensive, that American pilots were inadequately trained, that American forces would be defeated piecemeal when confronted by concentrated Japanese striking power. The Americans had deployed just 3 carriers, Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown, the latter hastily repaired from damage suffered at Coral Sea just 1 month earlier. They had fewer aircraft, Their pilots averaged 300–400 hours of flight training compared to 700+ hours for Japanese aviators. Their doctrine emphasized dispersed operations rather than concentrated strikes. By every measure Japanese planners considered relevant, the Americans were outmatched. Yet in 5 minutes of devastating dive-bomber attacks, the Americans had achieved what Japanese doctrine claimed was impossible: complete surprise, perfect coordination despite arriving in separate formations, and catastrophic damage that eliminated Japan's offensive carrier capability permanently. The question that would haunt Japanese admirals for the rest of their lives was simple. How had they been so completely, catastrophically wrong about American capabilities? The answer lay not in any single factor, but in the collision of multiple Japanese assumptions with uncomfortable realities. Japanese admirals had dismissed American carrier doctrine as inferior without recognizing that American advantages in code-breaking intelligence, damage control, and industrial capacity could compensate for tactical disadvantages. They had designed their strategy around achieving decisive battle where Japanese tactical excellence would prove overwhelming, never imagining that Americans would choose the battlefield, the timing, and attack Japanese vulnerabilities rather than strengths. They had convinced themselves that warrior spirit and pilot skill would overcome material disadvantages, never accounting for the possibility that Americans might possess both adequate warrior spirit and overwhelming material advantages. Most fundamentally, they had based their entire strategic conception on the assumption that they understood how carrier warfare would be fought, never considering that the Americans might fight a completely different kind of war, one based on intelligence, industrial attrition, and willingness to accept tactical disadvantages while exploiting strategic advantages. The collapse of Japanese naval supremacy at Midway did not begin on June 4, 1942. It began years earlier with assumptions that became doctrine, doctrine that became dogma, and dogma that prevented Japanese leadership from recognizing realities that contradicted comfortable beliefs. The roots of the disaster stretched back through every decision that had seemed brilliant in execution but rested on foundations of strategic delusion. The Americans had not become better overnight. The Japanese had simply never been as superior as they had convinced themselves they were. And at Midway, the price of that delusion would be paid in 4 burning carriers, thousands of dead sailors and pilots, and the permanent loss of offensive capability that would doom Japan to 3 years of defensive warfare ending in unconditional surrender. This is the story of how Japanese admirals dismissed American carrier doctrine as amateurish imitation of superior Japanese methods, convinced themselves that tactical excellence would overcome industrial disadvantages, and discovered at terrible cost that in modern warfare, adequate doctrine supported by superior resources defeats perfect doctrine constrained by limited capacity. It is the story of how numbers beat Bushido, how industrial power overwhelmed warrior spirit, and how the Battle of Midway and 5 minutes of dive-bomber attacks destroyed not just 4 carriers, but the entire strategic conception that had justified Japan's entry into the Pacific War. The roots of Japanese confidence stretched back to December 7, 1941, Pearl Harbor. Segment 1. The Illusion of Invincibility. Pearl Harbor's Dangerous Lessons. Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo had commanded the 6-carrier strike force that had attacked the American Pacific Fleet at anchor. The operation had been flawless. 353 aircraft launched in 2 waves had destroyed or severely damaged 18 warships, including 8 battleships, while suffering losses of only 29 aircraft. The 6 carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu, Shokaku, and Zuikaku, had executed the most complex naval aviation operation in history, with precision that seemed to validate every assumption about Japanese tactical superiority. Nagumo returned to Japan as a hero who had executed the most successful carrier strike in naval history. His after-action report, preserved in Japanese naval archives, radiated confidence. The attack demonstrates the overwhelming superiority of Japanese carrier aviation. American air defenses were ineffective. American fighter response was negligible. American damage control was inadequate. The attack confirms that our doctrine of massed carrier strikes, executed by elite pilots with superior aircraft, represents the apex of naval warfare. No navy can match our capability. The Americans will require years to recover, by which time our conquests will be irreversible. But Pearl Harbor taught Japanese leadership exactly the wrong lessons. The attack had succeeded not because of tactical brilliance alone, but because of complete strategic surprise against an unprepared enemy at anchor in port. The Americans had no radar warning, no dispersed fleet, no combat air patrol overhead. It was target practice, not combat against an alerted, competent opponent. Yet Japanese admirals interpreted Pearl Harbor as validation that their massed carrier doctrine would work against any enemy under any circumstances. Commander Mitsuo Fuchida, who led the Pearl Harbor airstrike, understood the danger of this interpretation even at the time. His diary entry from December 8, 1941, revealed prescient concerns. Our attack succeeded beyond all expectations. Yet I am troubled by what we did not encounter. The American carriers were not present. They will form the core of their counterattack. We struck ships at anchor with no warning. Future battles will be against fleets under steam with radar detection. We faced minimal fighter opposition. American fighters will improve. Most concerning, our success may convince our admirals that this level of victory is achievable in future operations. Pearl Harbor was not typical carrier warfare. It was the best possible circumstances meeting the worst possible American preparation. We should not expect such advantages again. Fuchida's warnings went unheeded. The Imperial Japanese Navy's leadership had found in Pearl Harbor the validation they sought for doctrines developed over 2 decades. They would spend the next 6 months applying those doctrines with consistent success, never recognizing that they were fighting an enemy, still reeling from surprise, still learning, still unprepared. By the time the Americans adapted, Japanese doctrine had calcified into dogma that could not adjust to changed circumstances. Segment 2. Perfection versus adequacy. The pilot training paradox. The elite status of Japanese naval aviators represented both Japan's greatest strength and a fatal vulnerability. The training program that produced these pilots was the most rigorous in the world and also the least sustainable for protracted warfare. Lieutenant Zenji Abe entered the Japanese Naval Aviation Training Program in 1938 as one of 1,500 candidates. 3 years later, he graduated as one of 340 survivors qualified for carrier operations. His memoir, published in 1952, described the program. "We trained for 3 years before qualifying for carrier duty. Every day began before dawn with physical conditioning that would break average men. Flight training was merciless. Instructors accepted nothing less than perfection. I watched classmates die in training accidents caused by demanding standards that treated human life as less valuable than maintaining elite status. Navigation training required pinpoint accuracy over open ocean without landmarks. We flew 700+ hours before carrier, qualification, practicing until we could land on a pitching deck in darkness, locate targets 300 kilometers from our carriers, and execute coordinated attacks with split-second timing. The results were undeniable. By 1941, Japanese carrier pilots represented the finest naval aviators in existence. They could navigate by dead reckoning across hundreds of kilometers of open ocean. They could coordinate complex attacks involving dive bombers, torpedo bombers, and fighters arriving simultaneously on target. They could land on carriers in weather that would ground American pilots. At Pearl Harbor, the Battle of the Indian Ocean, and the early Philippines campaigns, these elite pilots had demonstrated capabilities that American aviators could not match. But the program had a fatal flaw. It could not scale. Japan's limited resources and doctrinal rigidity meant the training pipeline produced perhaps 100–150 fully qualified carrier pilots per year. This was adequate for maintaining peacetime force levels, catastrophically insufficient for wartime attrition. Every elite pilot killed in combat represented 3 years of training investment that could not be rapidly replaced. The program was designed to produce perfection, not quantity. American carrier pilot training in early 1942 was demonstrably inferior by Japanese standards. Ensign George Gay, one of Torpedo Squadron 8's few survivors at Midway, described his training. "I received about 305 hours of total flight time before being assigned to an operational squadron. The Japanese pilots we faced at Midway had more than twice that training. We knew we were less skilled individually. Our navigation was shakier. Our formation flying was less precise. We made mistakes that Japanese pilots wouldn't have made. But there were a lot of us, and more were graduating from training programs every month." The Americans had chosen quantity over quality, betting that adequate pilots produced in large numbers would eventually overwhelm elite pilots produced in small numbers. The contrast extended beyond flight hours to program philosophy. Japanese training emphasized individual excellence. Each pilot was expected to master all aspects of naval aviation. American training emphasized specialized adequacy. Pilots learned what they needed for specific roles. A Japanese pilot could fly dive bombers, torpedo bombers, or fighters with equal skill. An American pilot specialized in one aircraft type and learned that role thoroughly, but not other roles. The Japanese approach produced more versatile aviators. The American approach produced more pilots. By June 1942, this difference seemed to validate Japanese superiority. At Coral Sea in May, Japanese pilots had demonstrated better attack coordination and more accurate bombing than American squadrons. Japanese losses were proportionally lower despite facing roughly equal opposition, but the strategic mathematics were already working against Japan. At Coral Sea, Japan lost approximately 90 aircraft and 77 pilots killed. America lost 66 aircraft and 53 pilots killed. Japan's pilot training pipeline would require 2 years to replace those 77 pilots with aviators of equivalent skill. American training programs would graduate replacement pilots within 2 months. Captain Minoru Genda, architect of Japanese carrier tactics, recognized this vulnerability in a confidential memorandum to Admiral Yamamoto dated March 1942. "Our pilot training program produces the finest aviators in the world. This is both our strength and our weakness. Each pilot requires 3 years to achieve full combat readiness. American pilots require less training but are produced in far greater numbers. In a short war where initial superiority determines outcomes, our approach is ideal. In a long war of attrition, American numerical advantages in pilot production will eventually overcome our qualitative advantages in pilot skill. We must achieve decisive victory before American training programs generate pilot numbers sufficient to overwhelm our forces through sheer quantity. Time is not on our side." Yamamoto understood this warning, which is why he pushed for the Midway operation designed to destroy American carrier forces in a single decisive battle. What neither Yamamoto nor Genda fully grasped was that American advantages extended beyond pilot quantity to intelligence capabilities that would allow inferior American pilots to ambush superior Japanese forces under circumstances where skill mattered less than surprise and timing. Segment 3. Concentrated power versus distributed resilience. The doctrinal divide. Japanese and American carrier doctrines represented fundamentally different philosophies about how naval aviation should be employed. The differences would prove decisive at Midway. Japanese doctrine emphasized offensive concentration. Multiple carriers operated together in a single striking force, the Kido Butai, allowing massed strikes of 200-plus aircraft that could overwhelm any defense. This concentration maximized offensive power but created vulnerabilities. If the concentrated force was surprised or defeated, Japan's entire carrier capability could be destroyed in a single action. Commander Minoru Genda's tactical manual, used throughout the Imperial Japanese Navy's carrier forces, explained the philosophy. Carrier warfare will be decided by the first strike. The side that achieves surprise and delivers massed attack with overwhelming force will destroy the enemy's carrier capability before effective counterattack is possible. Therefore, we concentrate our carriers to maximize first strike power. Dispersion dilutes striking power and ensures defeat in detail. We accept the risk of concentration because the reward of overwhelming offensive capability outweighs the danger of concentrated vulnerability. American doctrine in early 1942 was less coherent but emphasized different principles. Carriers typically operated independently or in two carrier task forces, providing mutual support while distributing risk. This dispersion reduced the striking power of any individual force, but ensured that losing one or two carriers would not eliminate American offensive capability entirely. Rear Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher, who would command American forces at Coral Sea and Midway, explained the American approach in a pre-war tactical study. We cannot match Japanese carrier concentrations until our construction programs produce additional fleet carriers. Therefore, we must avoid decisive engagement on Japanese terms. We disperse our carriers to minimize losses from single attacks, operate within range of land-based air support when possible, and accept that our striking power will be inferior to concentrated Japanese forces. This is defensive thinking born of necessity, not doctrine born of confidence. The Coral Sea battle in May 1942 seemed to validate Japanese doctrinal superiority. Two Japanese carriers engaged two American carriers. The Japanese achieved better coordination, more accurate attacks, and inflicted greater damage relative to their own losses. The American carrier Lexington was sunk. Yorktown was damaged. The Japanese carrier Shokaku was damaged, but Shoho, a light carrier, was sunk. The tactical exchange slightly favored the Americans. Two Japanese carriers damaged, sunk, versus one American fleet carrier sunk and one damaged. But the engagement pattern confirmed Japanese beliefs about their tactical advantages. What Japanese analysts missed was that the Americans were learning while the Japanese were confirming what they already believed. After Coral Sea, American commanders conducted extensive debriefings analyzing coordination failures, communication problems, and tactical mistakes. Commander John Thatch, squadron commander aboard Yorktown, developed the Thatch-Weave defensive tactic after studying how his fighters had been overwhelmed by more maneuverable Japanese Zeros. This continuous adaptation would prove crucial at Midway. Japanese post-action analysis after Coral Sea focused on celebrating tactical successes rather than examining strategic implications. Rear Admiral Takeo Takagi's report concluded, American carrier operations remain inferior to Japanese doctrine. Their strikes arrived uncoordinated. Their fighter cover was inadequate. Their damage control, while effective on Yorktown, failed catastrophically on Lexington. With proper concentration of forces, we will overwhelm American carriers in future engagements. This assessment was technically accurate, but strategically meaningless. The Japanese had won tactically while losing strategically. Shokaku's damage and Zuikaku's aircraft losses meant both carriers missed the Midway operation, reducing Japanese carrier strength from 6 to 4. The Americans had lost Lexington but would have 3 carriers at Midway, including the supposedly crippled Yorktown, which Pearl Harbor damage control teams would repair in an impossible 72 hours. The doctrinal divide came to its decisive test at Midway. The Japanese concentrated 4 carriers in a single striking force, maximizing offensive power but creating a single point of catastrophic failure. The Americans deployed 3 carriers in 2 task forces, accepting reduced striking power per force, but distributing risk. When American dive bombers caught Nagumo's concentrated force, the doctrinal divide came to its decisive test at Midway. The Japanese concentrated 4 carriers in a single striking force, maximizing offensive power, but creating a single point of catastrophic failure. The Americans deployed 3 carriers in 2 task forces, accepting reduced striking power per force, but distributing risk. When American dive bombers caught Nagumo's concentrated force with aircraft on deck, refueling and rearming, all 4 Japanese carriers were vulnerable simultaneously. The very concentration that was supposed to provide overwhelming offensive power became a fatal weakness when the enemy chose the timing of engagement. Segment 4. The Invisible Weapon. Intelligence versus Assumptions. The most decisive advantage at Midway was one Japanese commanders never knew existed until after the battle. American cryptographic intelligence had broken Japanese naval codes. Commander Joseph Rochefort led Station Hypo, the U.S. Navy cryptographic unit at Pearl Harbor. By May 1942, his team could read approximately 40% of Japanese naval communications, enough to understand operational planning. When Japanese messages referenced an upcoming operation against AF, Rochefort devised a brilliant confirmation scheme. He ordered Midway to transmit an uncoded message reporting water purification problems. Days later, intercepted Japanese messages reported that AEV was experiencing fresh water shortages. The target was confirmed. Admiral Chester Nimitz, Commander-in-Chief of the Pacific Fleet, received intelligence that Japanese plans most senior commanders could only dream of: enemy objectives, force composition, operational timeline, and approach routes. This intelligence gave Nimitz the ability to position his outnumbered carriers for ambush, choosing the battlefield and timing rather than reacting to Japanese initiatives. It was the ultimate force multiplier. Inferior forces deployed with perfect intelligence overwhelm superior forces operating blind. The Japanese had no idea this advantage existed. Admiral Yamamoto's complex operational plan for Midway assumed Americans would react to events, discovering the Japanese approach only after the initial strike on Midway Island. The plan divided Japanese forces into multiple groups: a diversionary force attacking the Aleutian Islands, the carrier striking force under Nagumo, the occupation force for Midway, and Yamamoto's main battle force, with the super battleship Yamato trailing behind. This complexity was designed to confuse American intelligence and force dispersed American responses that could be defeated in detail. Instead, Nimitz ignored the Aleutians' diversion entirely and concentrated his 3 carriers precisely where they would intercept Nagumo's force. The Americans knew where to wait, when to launch strikes, and what forces they faced. The Japanese operated under assumptions that were 12 hours out of date the moment Nagumo's carriers began their approach. Captain Yasumi Doi, intelligence officer on Yamamoto's staff, would later reflect on this failure in post-war interrogations. "We never imagined the Americans could read our codes. Our communication security was considered excellent. The possibility that the enemy possessed detailed knowledge of our operational plans was not even discussed." At Midway, we operated under the assumption that we possessed intelligence advantages from superior scouting. In reality, the Americans knew more about our fleet's location and intentions than some of our own commanders. This intelligence disparity made tactical excellence irrelevant. The Americans were not better than us. They simply knew where we would be and positioned forces accordingly. We were not defeated by superior doctrine. We were defeated by superior intelligence, enabling inferior doctrine to succeed. The intelligence advantage extended beyond code breaking. American radar, primitive by later standards but far superior to Japanese equipment, provided early warning of approaching aircraft. American damage control procedures, developed from exhaustive study of ship firefighting and flooding control, allowed carriers to survive hits that would have proven fatal to Japanese vessels. The Americans had advantages in multiple categories that Japanese planning had dismissed or ignored. Segment 5. The Mathematics of Vulnerability. The fatal 90 minutes. The Battle of Midway was decided in the 90 minutes between 08 a.m. and 09:30 a.m. on June 4th, when Admiral Nagumo faced decisions that would destroy his force regardless of which choice he made. At 04:30 a.m., Nagumo launched 108 aircraft to strike Midway Island, retaining 93 aircraft aboard his carriers, armed for anti-ship strikes in case American carriers appeared. This split force represented sound doctrine, suppressed the island's defenses, while maintaining capability to strike enemy ships if encountered. The attack proceeded as planned until 07 a.m., when the Midway Strike Commander reported, "Second strike necessary. Enemy defenses remain effective." Simultaneously, Japanese reconnaissance aircraft reported contact with American ships. The initial report indicated cruisers and destroyers, troublesome but not critically threatening. Nagumo ordered the 93 aircraft reserved for ship strikes to be rearmed with land attack weapons for a second Midway strike. Ordnance crews began removing torpedoes and armor-piercing bombs, replacing them with fragmentation bombs and general-purpose munitions. At 07:45 a.m., a scout plane amended its report. Enemy force includes what appears to be a carrier. Nagumo faced an immediate crisis. Aircraft armed for land attack were useless against warships. He needed anti-ship weapons, but changing armament again would require another hour. And the first Midway strike was returning low on fuel, requiring immediate landing. The carriers needed clear decks to recover aircraft. Nagumo made the decision that Japanese doctrine dictated: recover the returning Midway strike, rearm all aircraft properly for anti-ship operations, then launch a massive coordinated strike against the American carrier force. This was textbook carrier doctrine. Don't launch piecemeal attacks, wait for proper coordination, hit the enemy with overwhelming force. It was also exactly wrong for this specific situation. Lieutenant Commander Shigekazu Shimazaki, a bomber pilot returning from the Midway strike, watched events unfold from his cockpit. We landed aboard Kaga at 8:55, after 6 hours of operations. I was exhausted. My aircraft was nearly out of fuel, and I had expended all ordnance. As we landed, I saw the flight decks crowded with aircraft being rearmed. Ordnance crews were rushing, switching weapons configurations. Torpedoes and bombs were stacked on the hangar decks. Aviation fuel lines were open, refueling aircraft. I thought to myself, if American aircraft catch us like this, we will burn. 25 minutes later, American dive bombers appeared overhead. I was in the ready room when the first bombs hit. The carrier transformed into hell in seconds. The 90-minute window between 07:45 a.m., when Nagumo learned of American carriers, and 09:20 a.m., when he was ready to launch his strike, represented the fatal vulnerability of Japanese doctrine. The emphasis on coordinated massed strikes meant Nagumo would not launch until everything was perfect. The Americans, operating with inferior doctrine but superior intelligence, had launched maximum effort strikes at extreme range 2 hours earlier. They accepted uncoordinated attacks, accepted that aircraft might not return due to fuel shortage, accepted tactical disadvantages because strategic intelligence told them exactly when the Japanese would be most vulnerable. American torpedo bombers arrived first at 09:30 a.m. and were massacred. 35 of 41 shot down without scoring a single hit. Japanese doctrine seemed vindicated, but those torpedo attacks drew Japanese fighters to low altitude and pulled the combat air patrol out of position. The carriers maneuvered violently, disrupting formation. Nobody was watching the high-altitude approach corridors. At 10:22 a.m., American dive bombers emerged from clouds directly overhead with no Japanese fighters at altitude to intercept them. For 3 minutes, the Americans had free runs on the most valuable targets in the Pacific Fleet. Segment 6. 3 minutes that changed the war. The dive bomber attack. Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey, leading Enterprise's dive bombers, had been searching for the Japanese carriers for over 2 hours. His fuel was critically low. He had missed the expected intercept point and was about to turn back when he spotted a Japanese destroyer racing northeast. Following the destroyer's wake, McCluskey found the Japanese carriers. His after-action report captured the moment with clinical precision. At 10:22 a.m., I sighted 4 carriers in formation below, turning into the wind to launch aircraft. Their decks were crowded with planes. No fighters intercepted us during our approach. They were all at low altitude engaging our torpedo bombers. I pushed over into my dive from 14,000 feet, selecting Kaga as my target. Anti-aircraft fire was minimal initially. I released at 2,500 feet and pulled out. My bomb struck just aft of the carrier's island superstructure. Looking back, I saw Kaga's deck erupting in explosions. Other dive bombers from my squadron and from Yorktown's squadron were hitting Akagi and Soryu simultaneously. In less than 5 minutes, the entire Japanese carrier force was burning. I've never seen such devastation achieved so quickly. Aboard Kaga, Lieutenant Commander Shimazaki experienced the attack from below. The first bomb struck without warning. We had no idea American aircraft were overhead. The explosion shook the entire ship. Secondary explosions began immediately. The hangar deck was packed with aircraft being fueled and armed. Everything ignited at once. Aviation fuel spread fire across the deck. Torpedoes exploded. Bombs detonated. Within 2 minutes, Kaga was a blazing wreck. I tried to reach the flight deck but was driven back by flames. The heat was unbearable. Men were burning alive. I found an escape route to the weather deck and jumped overboard. In the water, I watched my carrier burn. 3 other carriers were also aflame. I knew we had lost the battle. More than that, we had lost the war. The attack succeeded beyond anything American Doctrine predicted possible. 17 dive bombers attacked Kaga, achieving at least 4 direct hits. 14 dive bombers attacked Akagi, achieving 2 direct hits. 13 dive bombers attacked Soryu, achieving 3 direct hits. The hit percentage was extraordinary. Approximately 25% of bombs released struck their targets, far exceeding the 5 to 10% average for dive bombing attacks. The Japanese carrier's vulnerability multiplied the damage. Caught with ordnance on deck, fuel lines open, and aircraft being armed, the carriers were floating bombs waiting for ignition. Akagi's damage control officer, Lieutenant Joichai Tominaga, died attempting to contain fires below decks. His final radio transmission to the bridge reported, "Hangar deck fire out of control. Torpedoes are detonating. Forward magazines flooding to prevent catastrophic explosion. I'm ordering all personnel to evacuate this section. The ship cannot be saved. I repeat, Akagi cannot be saved." The flagship that had led the Pearl Harbor attack was finished 3 minutes after the first bomb struck. Kaga suffered even more catastrophic damage. 4 bomb hits penetrated to the hangar deck, where stacked ordnance created a chain reaction of explosions. Fire spread so rapidly that damage control parties could not reach their stations. Within 10 minutes of the first hit, Kaga's captain ordered abandon ship. The carrier that had pioneered Japanese carrier operations would sink that evening, carrying 811 dead with her. Soryu, the fastest of the 4 carriers, took 3 bombs in rapid succession. The ship's engineer, Lieutenant Commander Hisashi Ohara, was in the engine room when the attack began. We felt 3 massive impacts in quick succession. The engine room filled with smoke. Orders came to maintain maximum power so the ship could maneuver. We kept the engines running for 20 minutes while the ship burned above us. Eventually, smoke became so thick we could not breathe. The captain ordered engine room evacuation. As I climbed the ladder to the upper decks, I knew Soryu was doomed. The Japanese carrier force had been destroyed in the time it takes to drink a cup of tea. Only Hiryu, steaming several kilometers away from the main carrier formation, escaped the initial attack. This dispersion, a deviation from standard Japanese doctrine, saved one carrier while condemning 3. But Hiryu's survival would prove temporary. Segment 7. The damage that could not be controlled. Structural weakness exposed. The catastrophic fires aboard the Japanese carriers revealed a vulnerability that American carriers did not share: inadequate damage control systems. Japanese carrier design emphasized offensive capability at the expense of survivability. Hangar decks were open to allow rapid aircraft movement and to provide natural ventilation for engine exhaust. This design facilitated flight operations but created perfect conditions for fire spread. When bombs detonated in the hangar decks, fires had unlimited oxygen and spread through open spaces with devastating speed. American carriers used a different design philosophy. Closed hangar decks with mechanical ventilation systems limited fire spread. Multiple redundant fire mains ensured water remained available even after damage. Damage control parties trained exhaustively in firefighting and flood control. The difference was philosophical. Japanese designers prioritized offensive operations, assuming carriers would not be hit, while American designers assumed carriers would be hit and prioritized survivability. USS Yorktown, damaged at Coral Sea and supposedly crippled, demonstrated this difference. At 12:20 p.m. on June 4th, Japanese aircraft from Hiryu attacked Yorktown with bombs and torpedoes. 3 bombs struck the carrier, causing fires and flooding. By Japanese standards, this damage should have been fatal. Instead, Yorktown's damage control parties contained the fires within an hour. The carrier resumed flight operations. Second strike at 02:45 p.m. finally crippled Yorktown with 2 torpedo hits. But even then, the ship remained afloat for 2 more days before being sunk by a Japanese submarine. Yorktown absorbed 5 bomb hits and 2 torpedo hits over 6 hours and remained afloat. Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu each sank from damage caused by 2-4 bomb hits in the first few minutes. Commander Clarence Aldrich, Yorktown's damage control officer, explained the difference. Japanese carriers are built for offense. Ours are built to take punishment and keep fighting. When we took those first 3 bomb hits, we had fires on 3 decks, but our damage control teams knew exactly what to do. We isolated the fires, maintained power to critical systems, and had the carrier operational again within an hour. I watched Japanese carriers burn at Midway, and I could tell their damage control was overwhelmed immediately. They never had a chance to save their ships because their ships weren't designed to be saved. The structural differences reflected deeper philosophical differences. Japanese naval architecture emphasized the warrior ethos of Bushido. Attack aggressively, destroy the enemy, don't plan for defeat. American naval architecture reflected industrial pragmatism. Ships will be hit, design them to survive, maintain operational capability despite damage. At Midway, pragmatism defeated philosophy. Segment 8. The Industrial Mathematics. Quantity as its own quality. Even before Midway, the mathematics of carrier production doomed Japan's naval aviation strategy. The battle merely accelerated the inevitable. In June 1942, Japan possessed 10 aircraft carriers of all types operational or under construction. The Imperial Japanese Navy's shipbuilding capacity could produce approximately 1 to 2 fleet carriers annually under wartime conditions. Pilot training programs graduated approximately 100 to 150 fully qualified carrier pilots per year. These production rates were adequate for maintaining peacetime force levels, but catastrophically insufficient for wartime attrition. The United States in June 1942 had 8 fleet carriers operational, under construction, or completing final trials. But American shipyards had 20 additional Essex-class fleet carriers on order, With construction timelines averaging 18 months from keel laying to commissioning, American pilot training programs were expanding to graduate thousands of aviators monthly. The industrial disparity was not close, it was overwhelming. Admiral Yamamoto understood these numbers, which is why he sought decisive battle at Midway. His letter to Navy Minister Shimada, dated May 5, 1942, laid out the mathematics. We must destroy American carrier forces before their industrial advantages become decisive. Currently, we possess rough parity in carrier numbers. Within 1 year, American shipyards will have produced sufficient fleet carriers to outnumber our entire force. Within 2 years, American carrier superiority will be so overwhelming that tactical excellence cannot compensate. We have perhaps 6 months to achieve decisive victory. After that, we will be fighting defensive battles against enemies who can absorb losses we cannot sustain. The Battle of Midway transformed Yamamoto's timeline from months to immediate. Japan lost 4 fleet carriers, 40% of its total carrier force, in 1 day. American shipyards had 7 Essex-class carriers under construction that would commission in 1943. By mid-1944, the United States would deploy 15 fleet carriers, each larger and more capable than Japanese fleet carriers. Japan would complete 6 additional fleet carriers during the entire war, total production that America matched every 6 months. The pilot mathematics were even worse. Japan lost approximately 110 experienced pilots at Midway, pilots with 700-plus hours of training and combat experience. Replacing them with equivalently trained aviators would require 3 years. The Americans lost approximately 75 experienced pilots, but graduated replacement pilots from training programs within 8 weeks. The replacements had less training than the pilots they replaced, but there were far more of them. Captain Mitsuo Fuchida, the Pearl Harbor strike commander who was aboard a Kagi during Midway recovering from appendicitis, survived the battle and reflected on the industrial implications in his post-war memoir. We lost 4 carriers and could not build replacements fast enough to matter. We lost 110 elite pilots and could not train replacements with equivalent skills. The Americans lost 1 carrier and had 7 more under construction. They lost 75 pilots and graduated 500 replacement pilots that month. The mathematics were brutal and irrefutable. Japan's carrier aviation strategy required quick victory achieved through tactical excellence. Midway destroyed that possibility. After Midway, we were fighting a war of industrial attrition against an enemy with 10 times our production capacity. Tactical excellence cannot overcome 10-to-1 industrial disadvantages. We learned that lesson at Midway. We kept learning it for 3 more years as American carriers appeared in numbers we could not match and could not sink faster than they were produced. Segment 9. The Evolution of American Doctrine. Learning versus repeating. The most significant difference between Japanese and American carrier forces was not technological or numerical. It was institutional. The Americans learned from mistakes and adapted doctrine continuously. The Japanese perfected doctrine and repeated it. After Coral Sea, American carrier forces conducted extensive analysis of coordination failures, communication problems, and tactical errors. Squadron commanders submitted after-action reports identifying specific problems and proposing solutions. Fighter tactics were revised based on combat experience. Strike coordination procedures were updated. Damage control techniques were refined. The U.S. Navy treated each battle as a learning opportunity. Commander John Thatch, squadron commander aboard Yorktown, developed the Thatch-Weave defensive fighter tactic after analyzing how his Wildcats had been outmaneuvered by Japanese Zeros at Coral Sea. The tactic allowed 2 fighters to provide mutual support, covering each other's vulnerable positions. Thatch described his reasoning. The Zero was more maneuverable than our Wildcats. In one-on-one turning fights, we lost. So I developed tactics where we never fought one-on-one. We fought in pairs, covering each other. When a Zero got on my tail, my wingman would turn into him, forcing the Zero to break off or be shot down. This simple tactical adjustment negated the Zero's maneuverability advantage. We didn't try to build better aircraft immediately. We adapted our tactics to the aircraft we had. The Thatch Weave was used effectively at Midway, allowing American fighters to hold their own against superior Japanese aircraft through tactical innovation rather than technological improvement. This willingness to adapt based on experience characterized American carrier operations throughout the war. Japanese carrier forces conducted no equivalent systematic analysis. After Coral Sea, Japanese commanders celebrated tactical successes rather than examining strategic vulnerabilities. The doctrine that had succeeded at Pearl Harbor remained unchanged. Training programs continued emphasizing the same skills. Tactics remained static. The Imperial Japanese Navy had achieved near perfection in carrier operations by 1941 and saw no need to modify what worked. Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa, who would command Japanese carrier forces later in the war, reflected on this difference in post-war interrogations. The Americans were constantly changing, constantly improving. Every battle taught them lessons they incorporated into future operations. We continued doing what had worked in 1941, never recognizing that circumstances had changed. By 1944, American carrier doctrine had evolved beyond recognition from what they practiced in 1942. Japanese carrier doctrine in 1944 was identical to 1941 doctrine, just executed by less skilled pilots with fewer resources. Static perfection was defeated by continuous improvement. That is the fundamental lesson we failed to learn. Segment 10. The Philippine Sea. The Doctrine's Final Humiliation. By June 1944, the carrier balance had reversed so completely that the Battle of the Philippine Sea became known as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, a term that captured how one-sided carrier warfare had become. American Task Force 58 deployed 15 fleet carriers and 956 aircraft. The Japanese Mobile Fleet deployed 9 carriers, including smaller light carriers, and 473 aircraft. The numerical disparity was overwhelming, but the qualitative gap was even more significant. American pilots averaged 300 hours of flight training, less than Japanese. Pilots had received in 1941, but adequate for basic carrier operations. Japanese pilots in 1944 averaged 30-40 hours of flight training because the pilot training pipeline had collapsed under attrition. The elite aviators of Pearl Harbor and Midway were mostly dead, replaced by barely qualified novices. The battle unfolded with predictable brutality. Japanese aircraft attacked American carriers in small groups rather than coordinated masses, because they lacked the training to execute complex, coordinated strikes. American radar detected Japanese formations before visual range. American fighters intercepted with numerical superiority at every engagement. American anti-aircraft fire, dramatically improved since 1942, created zones of such dense fire that Japanese aircraft could not penetrate. Over 2 days, American pilots shot down 600-plus Japanese aircraft while losing fewer than 30 of their own. The exchange ratio, 20 Japanese aircraft destroyed for every American loss, demonstrated complete American air superiority. 3 Japanese carriers were sunk. The Mobile fleet retreated, never again capable of offensive operations. Lieutenant Zenji Abe, one of the few elite pilots still alive in 1944, participated in the Philippine Sea battle and survived. I flew with boys who had weeks of training instead of years. They could barely land on carriers in daylight, let alone execute coordinated attacks or night operations. I watched them fly into American fighter screens and be slaughtered. They were brave, but bravery without skill is just another form of death. The Americans didn't need to outfly us anymore. They simply had to show up with overwhelming numbers and adequate training. Our doctrine of elite pilots executing perfect coordinated strikes was now just a memory. We were sending sacrificial victims into battles they had no chance of surviving. I knew then that everything we had believed about carrier warfare was wrong. Quality loses to quantity when the gap is this wide. The battle report, submitted by Vice Admiral Ozawa to Imperial Japanese Navy headquarters, made devastating reading. We attacked American carrier forces with everything available and achieved no significant results. American fighter direction was flawless. Their radar detected our attacks before we reached visual range. Their fighters intercepted with numerical superiority at every engagement. Their anti-aircraft fire was of density we could not penetrate. Our pilots, many of them newly trained replacements for veterans lost in previous battles, were slaughtered. We achieved perhaps 5 bomb hits on American carriers. All targets remained operational. American damage control prevented any catastrophic failures. In return, we lost 600 aircraft and most of our trained air crews. The Mobile fleet is no longer an effective fighting force. American carrier doctrine, which we dismissed in 1941 as inferior, has evolved into an overwhelming system that combines numerical superiority, technological advantage, and adequate pilot training into an unstoppable force. We cannot win carrier battles against such opposition. I recommend the remaining carriers be used for diversionary operations designed to preserve what little combat power remains. The recommendation was implemented at Leyte Gulf 4 months later, where Japanese carriers served as decoys to lure American forces away from invasion beaches. All 4 Japanese carriers deployed at Leyte Gulf were sunk. The carrier force that had humiliated the Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor had been completely eliminated. Segment 11. The Ghost of Yamamoto. The Prophet ignored Admiral Isoroku. Yamamoto did not live to see the complete destruction of Japanese carrier forces. He was killed on April 18, 1943, when American P-38 fighters intercepted his transport aircraft over Bougainville. The Americans had decoded Japanese messages revealing Yamamoto's travel schedule and executed a long-range intercept mission specifically to kill him. Yamamoto's death eliminated the one Japanese admiral who had consistently warned about the dangers of fighting an extended war against American industrial capacity. His pre-war assessment of the Pacific conflict had been brutally honest. If ordered to fight America, I can guarantee to give an uninterrupted succession of victories for 6 months to 1 year. After that, I have absolutely no confidence. The longer the war continues, the more certain American industrial advantages will prove decisive. The assessment was precise. Japanese carrier forces achieved continuous victories from Pearl Harbor in December 1941 through Coral Sea in May 1942, exactly 6 months. Midway in June 1942 marked the end of that dominance. By June 1943, 1 year after Midway, American carrier forces outnumbered Japanese forces. By June 1944, American carrier superiority was so overwhelming that Japanese carrier forces could not conduct effective operations. Yamamoto's timeline had been prophetic. His warnings about American industrial capacity had been equally accurate. Yamamoto had studied at Harvard and served as naval attaché in Washington. He understood American capabilities better than most Japanese officers. His letter to Navy Minister Oikawa, dated October 1940, revealed his concerns. I have seen American industry. I have studied American production capacity. If we fight a war of attrition with America, we will lose. American factories can produce more ships, more aircraft, more weapons than we can destroy. American resources are so vast that sustained warfare will bury us under material superiority we cannot match. Our only hope is quick victory achieved through tactical excellence. If we cannot force decisive American defeat within 1 year, we will be fighting a war we cannot win. These warnings were dismissed by officers who believed in Bushido. The warrior spirit that allegedly made Japanese forces superior regardless of material disadvantages. The results validated Yamamoto's warnings and invalidated Bushido as strategic doctrine. Spirit could not compensate for American production of 149 carriers during the war, while Japan built 20. Training could not overcome American graduation of 60,000 pilots, while Japan trained perhaps 10,000. Tactical excellence could not defeat enemies who possessed radar, superior damage control, cryptographic intelligence, and overwhelming numbers. Commander Minoru Genda, who survived the war and became Chief of Staff of Japan's post-war Air Self-Defense Force, reflected on Yamamoto's warnings in a 1960 interview. Admiral Yamamoto told us everything we needed to know. He warned us about American industrial capacity. He warned us that extended warfare would destroy us. He warned us that our tactical advantages were temporary. We heard his words but did not believe them because they contradicted what we wanted to believe. We thought Bushido would overcome material disadvantages. We thought elite pilots would defeat numerically superior but less trained opponents. We thought concentrated carrier strikes would achieve decisive victories that would end the war before American production advantages mattered. Yamamoto was correct about everything. We were wrong about everything. 4,000 Japanese sailors and pilots died at Midway, proving Yamamoto right. 20,000 more died in subsequent carrier battles fighting a war he had warned us we could not win. We should have listened. We should have believed him. We should have never started a war against an enemy with 10 times our industrial capacity. Segment 12. Lessons Written in Blood. The Doctrine That Died. The complete destruction of Japanese carrier forces by August 1945 provided unambiguous validation of harsh lessons about modern warfare. Japanese admirals had entered the war confident in doctrinal superiority, validated by decades of study and refinement. They ended the war with all carriers sunk or destroyed, all elite pilots dead, and doctrine revealed as inadequate for total war against an industrial superpower. A 1952 symposium of former Imperial Japanese Navy officers in Tokyo, including Admiral Ozawa and Commander Genda, among other surviving carrier commanders, produced a consensus statement analyzing where Japanese carrier doctrine had failed. We built our doctrine on assumptions that proved catastrophically false. First, we assumed that elite pilots with superior training would consistently defeat numerically superior but adequately trained opponents. Combat proved that adequate training combined with numerical superiority and technological support was strategically decisive. Individual pilot excellence mattered in small engagements but became irrelevant when facing enemies who could absorb losses and replace pilots monthly, while we required years to train replacements. Second, we assumed that offensive concentration would allow us to choose the terms of engagement and deliver overwhelming first strikes. The Americans possessed intelligence capabilities we never knew existed, allowing them to ambush our concentrated forces when we were maximally vulnerable. Our concentration, intended to provide offensive advantage, created a single point of catastrophic failure. Third, we assumed that Bushido, warrior spirit and willingness to die for victory, would compensate for material disadvantages. The Americans demonstrated equal or greater warrior spirit while possessing overwhelming material advantages. Spirit plus resources defeats spirit alone every time. Fourth, we assumed that tactical excellence and doctrinal sophistication would prove decisive in carrier warfare. The Americans demonstrated that adequate tactics supported by superior intelligence, damage control, and industrial capacity defeats perfect tactics constrained by limited resources. Most fundamentally, we designed doctrine around our limitations rather than exploiting our genuine advantages. We should have emphasized defensive operations that exploited interior lines and forced Americans to attack prepared positions at extended ranges. Instead, we sought offensive victories we lacked resources to sustain. American doctrine succeeded because it matched American capabilities. dispersed operations that accepted tactical disadvantages while exploiting strategic advantages in intelligence, industrial production, and damage control. Japanese doctrine failed because it aspired to achievements we lacked capacity to maintain, concentrated offensive operations requiring elite pilots we could not replace, and carriers we could not build fast enough. The fundamental lesson is brutal but clear. In total war between industrial powers, doctrine must reflect realistic assessment of national capabilities, not idealized vision of how wars should be fought. We fought the war we wanted to fight, rather than the war we had to fight. The Americans adapted to the war they faced. This difference, more than any tactical or technological factor, determined the outcome. The symposium's conclusions were presented to the Japanese Maritime Self-Defense Force as foundational lessons for post-war naval doctrine. The lessons influenced American naval thinking as well, validating the principles that had emerged through painful trial and error during the Pacific War. Conclusion: the mathematics of inevitability. The Battle of Midway ended Japanese offensive operations in the Pacific permanently. The tactical exchange, 4 Japanese carriers and 248 aircraft lost versus 1 American carrier and 145 aircraft, represented the decisive battle Admiral Yamamoto had sought. He had lost it, and with it, Japan's only path to victory. The statistics tell the story with brutal clarity. Japan possessed 10 aircraft carriers of all types in June 1942 and would complete 6 additional fleet carriers by war's end. The United States possessed 8 fleet carriers in June 1942 and would commission 141 additional carriers during the war. Japan's pilot training programs graduated approximately 10,000 naval aviators during the entire war. American programs graduated over 60,000. Japan lost 20 carriers sunk by war's end. America lost 12 carriers sunk, but commissioned 149 for net gain of 137 carriers. The mathematics were never close. They were overwhelming. Japanese carrier doctrine had been perfect for a short war of decisive engagements where tactical excellence determined outcomes. It was fatally inadequate for extended warfare where industrial capacity, sustainability, and adaptability proved decisive. The Americans had fought with inferior doctrine initially, but possessed advantages that compensated. Cryptographic intelligence that revealed enemy plans, damage control that kept carriers operational despite damage that would sink Japanese vessels, and industrial production that replaced losses faster than enemies could inflict them. For the 3,057 Japanese sailors and aviators who died at Midway, and the additional 20,000 who died in subsequent carrier battles, the war represented the collision of comforting lies with uncomfortable truths. They had been told they were invincible through superior spirit and training. They learned that spirit cannot defeat radar-directed fighters, that training cannot overcome intelligence that reveals your location before battle begins, and that tactical excellence cannot defeat enemies who possess adequate tactics and 10 times your resources. Admiral Taman Yamaguchi's final words aboard the burning Hiryu on June 5, 1942, captured the truth with devastating clarity. We have lost the war. He was correct. The war was lost at Midway, though 3 years of fighting would be required to force Japan's acceptance of that reality. Japanese carrier doctrine had been perfect for fighting the war Japanese admirals wanted. It was fatally inadequate for fighting the war they got. That inadequacy, dismissed until proven at horrific cost, determined the Pacific War's outcome more surely than any subsequent battle. Numbers had beaten Bushido. Industrial power had overwhelmed tactical perfection. The Americans had won not because their doctrine was superior, but because their doctrine was adequate and their resources were limitless. That was enough. It was always going to be enough. The lessons validated at Midway influenced naval warfare for decades. Post-war carrier doctrine, universally adopted principles validated by American successes. Distribute carriers for resilience rather than concentrating for offensive power, Emphasize adequate training achievable at scale over elite training, achievable only in limited numbers. Design carriers for survivability rather than purely offensive capability. Treat carriers and pilots as sustainable resources rather than irreplaceable assets. And adapt doctrine continuously based on combat experience rather than perfecting doctrine and repeating it unchanged. These principles, paid for by thousands of lives on both sides, became foundational truths for every navy that operated carriers in the Cold War and beyond. The Imperial Japanese Navy had been the world's preeminent carrier force in 1941, with doctrine refined through 20 years of study and validated by 6 months of continuous victory. By 1945, that force was completely destroyed, its doctrine revealed as inadequate, its elite pilots dead, its carriers sunk. The United States Navy had entered the war with fragmented doctrine, adequately trained pilots, and defensive mindset. By 1945, American carrier forces dominated every ocean, operating from 149 carriers with pilot pools so deep that combat veterans rotated home to train new squadrons while fresh pilots replaced them. The transformation was complete. The doctrine Japanese admirals had dismissed as amateurish imitation had evolved into an overwhelming system that combined adequate tactical capability with superior strategic intelligence, damage control, and industrial capacity. The doctrine Japanese admirals had perfected over decades had proven inadequate when confronted by enemies who fought differently than Japanese planners expected and possessed advantages Japanese planning had dismissed as irrelevant. In the end, the Battle of Midway and the subsequent destruction of Japanese carrier forces validated a fundamental truth about modern warfare. In conflicts between industrial powers, doctrine matters less than resources, tactical excellence matters less than strategic intelligence, and elite forces matter less than adequate forces, produced in overwhelming numbers. The Japanese learned this lesson at Midway on June 4, 1942, watching 4 carriers burn in 5 minutes. They kept learning it for 3 more years until the last Japanese carrier was sunk and the war ended in unconditional surrender. The Americans had not defeated Japan through superior carrier doctrine. They had defeated Japan by refusing to fight the war Japanese doctrine prepared for, exploiting advantages Japanese planning dismissed, and overwhelming tactical excellence through industrial capacity that made replacement of losses routine rather than catastrophic. Admiral Yamamoto had warned about this before the war began. Japanese admirals dismissed his warnings until Midway proved him correct. By then, it was too late. The wreckage of 4 Japanese carriers resting on the Pacific floor marked more than tactical defeat. It marked the death of a doctrine, the collapse of assumptions that had seemed unquestionable, and the moment when numbers proved more powerful than Bushido. That lesson, written in fire and blood on June 4, 1942, determined the Pacific War's outcome more surely than any subsequent engagement. Japanese carrier doctrine had died at Midway. Everything after was just confirmation of lessons that 4 burning carriers had already taught. The Americans had been right about nothing in particular and everything in general. Their doctrine was adequate. Their resources were limitless. Against an enemy with superior doctrine but finite resources, adequate and limitless always wins. Always. The enduring legacy of Midway extends far beyond the Pacific War. The battle fundamentally reshaped naval aviation doctrine across every navy that operated carriers in the decades that followed. The United States Navy's post-war carrier development reflected lessons validated by the destruction of Nagumo's force. The Forrestal-class supercarriers commissioned in the 1950s incorporated distributed damage control systems, redundant fire suppression capabilities, and armored flight decks designed to survive hits that would have destroyed World War II carriers. The angled flight deck innovation, adopted in 1952, allowed simultaneous launch and recovery operations that Japanese carriers' straight deck designs had never permitted. Carrier air wings expanded to 90-plus aircraft, reflecting the American principle that adequate capability multiplied by overwhelming numbers defeats concentrated excellence. Pilot training programs, standardized around producing competent aviators in quantity rather than elite specialists in limited numbers. The Soviet Navy, watching American carrier dominance in the Pacific, developed its own carrier doctrine in the 1960s that explicitly rejected Japanese concentration principles. Soviet carriers operated in defensive postures supporting submarine and surface forces rather than as independent offensive striking arms. The doctrine reflected Soviet recognition that carriers required massive supporting infrastructure that only superpowers could sustain, precisely the industrial capacity lesson that Japan had learned too late. British and French carrier development similarly emphasized sustainability and damage control over pure offensive capability. Incorporating American design principles validated at Midway into Ark Royal and Clemenceau-class carriers commissioned in the 1950s and 1960s. Even nations that never operated carriers absorbed Midway's lessons about the relationship between doctrine, resources, and realistic capability assessment. The Israeli Defense Forces' emphasis on combined arms operations, supported by adequate equipment, produced in sustainable quantities rather than exotic systems available in small numbers, reflects philosophical recognition that adequate capability at scale defeats perfection in limited quantity. The German Bundeswehr's post-war doctrine explicitly rejected the Wehrmacht's emphasis on tactical excellence and offensive operations, instead prioritizing defensive operations that exploited geographic advantages. The doctrine Japanese admirals should have adopted in the Pacific, but rejected because it contradicted Bushido mythology. The human cost of Japan's doctrinal failures extended beyond the 23,057 Japanese naval personnel killed in carrier operations during the war. The elite pilots who survived. Combat returned to a nation devastated by strategic bombing and atomic weapons, their skills rendered obsolete by the jet age, and their sacrifices viewed with increasing bitterness by a population that had been fed lies about inevitable victory. Lieutenant Zenji Abe, who survived the war as one of perhaps 2,000 carrier-qualified pilots who lived to see Japan's surrender, described the psychological burden in his 1952 memoir. "We were told we were the elite, that our training and spirit made us invincible. We watched our friends die by the thousands, shot down by American pilots who were supposed to be inferior but proved to be adequate enough when supported by radar, superior aircraft, and overwhelming numbers. By 1945, I was training boys with 30 hours of flight instruction who would die on their first missions. I knew we were sending them to pointless deaths, but we continued because to admit the war was lost would have been to admit that everything we had been told was a lie. The worst part was not the dying. Soldiers expect to die in war. The worst part was realizing that our leaders had known the war was unwinnable from the moment Midway destroyed our offensive capability. Yet they continued fighting for 3 more years, sacrificing tens of thousands of additional lives to delay the inevitable. The doctrine that we had perfected had failed, but rather than adapt, our leaders simply sent more men to die, proving the same failed principles over and over. The American pilots who had executed the dive bomber attacks at Midway carried their own burdens. Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey, who led the Enterprise dive bombers that destroyed Kaga, was awarded the Navy Cross but spent the rest of his life troubled by the knowledge that his 3-minute attack had killed over 800 Japanese sailors. His personal correspondence, donated to the Naval Academy Museum after his death in 1976, revealed complex feelings about the victory. I am proud of what we achieved at Midway. We saved our nation from potential defeat and turned the tide of the Pacific War. Yet I dream sometimes about the men who burned on those carriers, men who were simply serving their country as I was serving mine. They believed what their leaders told them about Japanese superiority and American weakness. They died because their admirals made catastrophic strategic miscalculations and refused to adapt when reality contradicted doctrine. I do not regret executing the attack. It was necessary and saved countless American lives by ending Japanese offensive capability. But I regret that so many men had to die, proving lessons that should have been obvious, that industrial wars are won by industrial powers, that perfect doctrine constrained by limited resources loses to adequate doctrine supported by unlimited resources, and that warrior spirit cannot overcome radar, intelligence, and 10-to-1 numerical advantages. Those 3,057 Japanese sailors and pilots who died at Midway were not our inferiors. They were brave men serving a cause that their leadership should have recognized as hopeless the moment they understood American industrial capacity. Admiral Chester Nimitz, who commanded Pacific Fleet operations throughout the war, reflected on Midway's significance in his 1960 memoir. His assessment captured both the tactical outcome and the deeper strategic lesson. The Battle of Midway was decided before the first aircraft launched. It was decided when American cryptographers broke Japanese codes, giving us intelligence that allowed us to position outnumbered forces for ambush. It was decided when American damage control teams repaired Yorktown in 72 hours, rather than the months Japanese planning assumed necessary. It was decided when American shipyards laid keels for Essex-class carriers that would commission faster than Japan could replace losses. The Japanese fought brilliantly at Midway. Their pilots were more skilled, their tactics were more sophisticated, their doctrine was more refined. But they fought a battle where brilliance could not overcome intelligence disadvantages, where skill could not compensate for industrial disparities, and where perfect doctrine proved inadequate when the enemy possessed adequate doctrine supported by overwhelming resources. Admiral Yamamoto had warned his government that Japan could not win an extended war against American industrial power. Midway proved him correct. The 4 Japanese carriers sunk that day represented 40% of Japan's fleet carrier strength, losses they could not replace before American production generated carriers in numbers that made Japanese resistance futile. We did not win at Midway because we were better. We won because we had broken their codes, because our carriers could survive damage theirs could not, and because our factories could replace our losses while theirs could not. That is not a particularly glorious basis for victory, but it is an honest one. Industrial wars are won by industrial powers. Midway proved that conclusively. The transformation of American carrier doctrine from the defensive fragmentation of early 1942 to the overwhelming striking power of 1945 represented the most dramatic doctrinal evolution in naval history. Task Force 38, which conducted strikes against Japan in July 1945, deployed 16 fleet carriers and 896 aircraft, more than twice the striking power of all Japanese carrier forces at their peak. The task force sank over 1,200 Japanese aircraft, destroyed countless ships and installations, and demonstrated complete air superiority over the Japanese home islands. The operation was executed with casualness that would have seemed impossible in 1942. Carriers conducted continuous operations for weeks. Pilots flew multiple sorties daily. Losses were accepted as routine rather than catastrophic. The doctrine that had seemed amateurish and fragmented to Japanese observers in 1941 had evolved into an overwhelming system that combined adequate tactical capability with superior intelligence, damage control, industrial sustainability, and most importantly, continuous adaptation based on combat experience. The Japanese, in contrast, continued executing the same carrier doctrine in 1945 that they had perfected in 1941. The final carrier operations of the war, the suicide missions of Operation Ten-Go in April 1945, saw Japanese aircraft attacking American carriers in small groups using tactics that had failed consistently since 1943. The attacks achieved minimal results at catastrophic cost, with over 1,400 Japanese aircraft destroyed, including pilots undertaking one-way kamikaze missions. The Americans adapted tactics to counter kamikazes within weeks. Expanded combat air patrols, radar picket ships, massed anti-aircraft fire. The Japanese never developed effective countermeasures to American radar, never implemented damage control systems that could save carriers hit by bombs, never expanded pilot training to replace losses at sustainable rates. The doctrine that had been perfected by 1941 remained unchanged until Japan's surrender in August 1945, executed by increasingly inexperienced pilots in increasingly obsolete aircraft against enemies who had evolved beyond recognition from the force that had fled Guadalcanal in early 1942. In the final accounting, Midway stands as history's definitive demonstration that in modern warfare between industrial powers, doctrine must reflect realistic capability assessment rather than idealized strategic vision. The Imperial Japanese Navy entered the war with the best carrier doctrine in existence, executed by the most skilled pilots in any navy, validated by 6 months of continuous victory. Yet that doctrine was designed around assumptions that proved catastrophically wrong. That elite pilots could consistently defeat numerically superior but adequately trained opponents. That concentrated offensive operations would allow Japan to choose engagement terms. That warrior spirit would compensate for industrial disadvantages, and that tactical excellence would prove decisive before American production advantages became overwhelming. Every assumption failed simultaneously at Midway. The Americans ambushed Japanese forces because code breaking provided intelligence that Japanese planners never imagined possible. Adequate American pilots executed coordinated attacks despite inferior doctrine because they attacked when Japanese carriers were maximally vulnerable. American carriers survived damage that would have sunk Japanese vessels because American design emphasized survivability over pure offensive capability. American industrial production replaced losses and expanded forces, while Japanese losses proved irreplaceable. The battle lasted approximately 6 hours from first contact to the crippling of Hiryu. The war lasted 3 more years, but the outcome was determined on June 4, 1942, when 4 Japanese carriers burned and with them died the possibility of Japanese victory. What followed was confirmation of lessons written that day in fire and blood. Japan could not replace 4 fleet carriers and 248 aircraft and 110 elite pilots while simultaneously fighting defensive campaigns across the Pacific. The United States replaced those losses within 6 months and expanded carrier forces continuously until Japanese resistance became futile. The mathematics were never in doubt after Midway. The only question was how long Japan would continue fighting and how many additional lives would be sacrificed before accepting the inevitable. For the Japanese admirals who had dismissed American carrier doctrine as inferior imitation, Midway provided brutal education. Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, whose force had been destroyed at Midway, commanded forces at Guadalcanal and Saipan before committing suicide during the battle for Saipan in July 1944 rather than face capture. His final letter, recovered after the battle, revealed that he had understood Midway's implications. The Americans defeated us not through superior skill, but through superior intelligence, superior resources, and superior adaptability. We continued executing perfect doctrine long after circumstances made that doctrine obsolete. I bear responsibility for losses at Midway that ensured our eventual defeat. The war was lost in 5 minutes on June 4, 1942. Everything since has been delaying the inevitable. Rear Admiral Taman Yamaguchi, the most tactically gifted Japanese carrier commander, had recognized the truth immediately aboard Hiryu. We have lost the war, and chose to die with his ship rather than live with the knowledge that Japanese doctrine had failed catastrophically. The story of Japanese admirals dismissing American carrier doctrine until Midway proved numbers beat Bushido stands as an enduring warning about the fatal consequences of basing military strategy on ideology rather than capability, on wishful thinking rather than realistic assessment, and on tactical preferences rather than strategic requirements. The Japanese designed doctrine for the war they wanted to fight, decisive engagements where elite forces achieved quick victory through tactical excellence. The Americans adapted to the war they faced, extended conflict where adequate forces, supported by superior intelligence and overwhelming industrial capacity, gradually overwhelmed opponents through sustained pressure. One approach relied on perfection that could not be sustained. The other relied on adequacy that could be endlessly reproduced. In total war between industrial powers, adequacy at scale defeats perfection in scarcity. Every time, without exception. The wreckage of Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu rests on the Pacific floor at depths exceeding 17,000 feet, beyond reach of casual salvage. Those 4 carriers carried more than 3,000 dead sailors to the bottom. They carried Japan's offensive capability. They carried the validation of 2 decades of doctrinal development. They carried the proof that elite forces and sophisticated doctrine cannot overcome industrial disadvantages, intelligence superiority, and enemies who adapt continuously while you repeat what worked once but fails now. The carriers are gone. The doctrine they represented is studied in military academies as an example of brilliance rendered irrelevant by strategic miscalculation. The admirals who perfected that doctrine are remembered as men who prepared superbly for the wrong war and paid for that error with their lives and the lives of tens of thousands under their command. The Americans who defeated them did not create superior doctrine. They created adequate doctrine supported by advantages their enemies dismissed as strategically irrelevant, code breaking that revealed enemy plans, damage control that kept carriers fighting, industrial production that replaced losses faster than enemies could inflict them, continuous adaptation that evolved tactics based on experience, realistic assessment of capabilities that matched doctrine to resources rather than aspirations. These advantages, none individually decisive, combined to create overwhelming superiority that rendered Japanese tactical excellence irrelevant. By 1945, American carrier forces operated with such complete dominance that Japanese resistance was treated as training exercises for new pilots. The transformation from December 1941, when Japanese carriers struck Pearl Harbor with impunity, to August 1945, when American carriers conducted strikes against Japan itself with casual dominance, represented the most dramatic reversal in naval power in history. That reversal began at Midway. It began when Japanese admirals' comfortable assumptions about American inferiority collided with uncomfortable realities about American advantages. It began in 5 minutes of dive bomber attacks that destroyed not just 4 carriers, but the entire strategic conception that had justified Japan's entry into the war. Numbers beat Bushido. Industrial power overwhelmed warrior spirit. Adequate and unlimited defeated perfect and finite. These lessons, written in the wreckage of Japanese carriers on June 4, 1942, remain as relevant in the 21st century as they were in World War II. Doctrine must match capability, not aspiration. Perfect forces in limited quantity lose to adequate forces in overwhelming quantity. Tactical excellence cannot compensate for strategic disadvantages in intelligence, sustainability, and industrial capacity. Continuous adaptation defeats static perfection. These truths, paid for by thousands of lives on both sides, validated by the complete destruction of Japanese carrier forces and the overwhelming American victory in the Pacific War, stand as enduring lessons for any nation contemplating conflict against opponents with superior resources. The Battle of Midway proved that in modern warfare, the side that fights the war as it actually is defeats the side that fights the war as they wish it were. The Japanese wished for a war where warrior spirit and tactical excellence determined outcomes. They got a war where industrial capacity and adaptability determined outcomes. The Americans faced reality, adapted to circumstances, and won. The Japanese clung to doctrine validated by past success, refused to adapt when circumstances changed, and lost. That is the lesson of Midway. That is why 4 Japanese carriers rest on the ocean floor while the doctrine they represented is studied as brilliant failure. That is why numbers beat Bushido, why adequate at scale beats perfect in scarcity, and why the Battle of Midway decided the Pacific War in 5 minutes of dive bomber attacks on June 4, 1942. Everything after was confirmation. The lesson had been taught. Japan spent 3 years learning it at terrible cost. The Americans had proven that their doctrine, dismissed as amateurish imitation by Japanese admirals, was adequate for victory when supported by advantages those admirals had failed to understand until it was too late. Adequate was enough. It was always going to be enough.